Greetings and welcome to this wonderful Huntington Learning Center webinar, supporting students with specific learning disabilities, what parents need to know. Tonight's presentation, we're greatly honored, is conducted by Dr. Robin Thoma. So we're really grateful to have Dr. Thoma with us today. I'm Michael Hackmer, I'll be your moderator for today's event. And on behalf of Huntington Learning Center and Dr. Thoma, I want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. We know that there's a lot of stuff going on, so we really appreciate you making the time to be with us. So before I introduce our speaker, I did want to go into a little bit of information about Huntington Learning Center. So Huntington's been around for 45 years. And during that time, we evolved into a leading tutoring and test prep organization that serves students in grades K through 12. There are three things that I think really differentiate Huntington from other tutoring and test prep programs, or just going out and hiring someone to tutor or test prep your child. And here's what they are. First, all of the programs that are taught at Huntington are done by highly trained and certified tutors. In fact, we have in the past won awards for our training department. We take it very, very seriously to make sure that everyone who interfaces with your child has the proper training and skill set to be able to get things and help your child succeed. The second is Huntington is accredited by Middle States Association of Colleges. And the reason why that's important is because as your child goes through their academic journey and they seek degrees and certifications from certain universities and colleges, many of those will be certified by Middle States. And so we think having that same level of certification and accreditation is really important. And third, and I really think this is probably the most important and really has distinguished Huntington as a leader, is that we use a targeted and individualized approach. So all of our learning programs are really personalized. And we do this, we get students in, do an assessment, do a practice test, we do a bunch of different things to really try to figure out what those strengths and weaknesses are. Because kids will come in and say, wow, I'm having trouble with math, or I'm having trouble with English, or I'm having trouble with study skills or test taking skills. And at the end of the day though, those strengths and weaknesses are going to vary between students. And we want to make sure that we address the weaknesses and help your student become more successful. And I think the results really do speak for themselves. In just about 3 months on average, Huntington students see an average increase in about 2.2 grade levels in reading and in math. And when you look at the test prep side of things, where you're looking at either the SAT or the ACT for college admissions exams, the average increase there is about 229 points for the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT, which is pretty significant given the competitiveness that we see in college. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Thoma. So she has been around for a long time. 18 years of her career has been spent as a high school special teacher, where she specialized in working with students with specific learning disabilities and autism, right? And so following her time in the classroom, she's worked at the university level, serving as an interim chairperson, the education department, and instructor at Indiana State University and at Minnesota State University as well. She's earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction at Indiana State. She's a member of the board of directors of the Learning Disability Association of America, and she's done a lot of other work across this space, and we're really, really excited to have her with us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Thoma.
All right, great. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the introduction. And as Michael said, I have worked in a high school classroom. I've taught at the college level. So I'm coming to this presentation with the perspective of an educator. But what I didn't include in my introduction is that I'm also a parent of a child with a specific learning disability. So our youngest son received an IEP when he was in 4th grade, and he is now a sophomore at Salem University in West Virginia, and he's a pitcher on the baseball team. So I do come to this with the lens of both. And when I was putting this presentation together, I really thought about what I wish I knew when he was younger to help him through the process and what types of supports I could provide him. So I hope to be able to share some resources and supports with you tonight. So during this presentation, we are going to talk about the definition of specific learning disabilities. We're going to identify some key characteristics. I'm going to talk about some school supports. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on executive function because that's an area I wish I knew more about when he was younger, and also resources that you can utilize and access that will help you support your child. So this presentation is really a big overview of specific learning disabilities, and many of these areas could be presentations of their own. So I wanted to give you just kind of a little bit of taste of lots of different areas. So first things first, I think it's really important for us to all be on the same page and to be aware of what the definition of specific learning disabilities is. And the definition comes from IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it governs IDEA governs special education across the United States. So there are 13 different disability categories in IDEA, and specific learning disabilities is one of those. So when I read the definition, and please follow along with me, you can think about all of those areas and how they can impact your students' learning. So the definition for specific learning disabilities is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, whether that's spoken or written, which may manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, and do mathematical calculations. Okay, so that's a lot of areas that can impact your child. So again, just to really point out these things, it's listening, it's thinking, it's speaking, it's reading, writing, spelling, and doing mathematical calculations. So when you think about your learner and the demands that are placed on all of these abilities during a typical school day, all these areas are impacted, and that's regardless of grade level or subject area. So a lot of times I think we just think about reading and math, but it really goes way beyond those two areas. And just really quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the statistics. The Pew Research Center reported that 32% of students with disabilities have a specific learning disability. So that's about 1/3 of the students with a learning disability, or 1/3 of students with an IEP have a learning disability. So there are a lot of resources available to support students with specific learning disabilities because it's such a high incidence area. I'm in Indiana. My project is in Illinois, so I'm most familiar with Indiana and Illinois school systems, but the numbers are the same in both of those areas. It's about 33% of students with IEPs have been identified as having a specific learning disability. So in Indiana specifically, there are about 169,000 students with an IEP, and almost 53,000 of those kids have a specific learning disability. And then most people are probably familiar with these terms. Specific learning disabilities encompasses a lot of different areas, and there's not really time to go into these three areas, but I want to make sure you're familiar with the terms. Most people have heard of dyslexia, and that of course is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. And again, most people are familiar with that term, but I think less people are familiar with dyscalculia, with dysgraphia, that's the middle one. Dysgraphia can impact the physical act of writing and with translating thoughts into the written word. So it's both physical and getting those ideas onto paper, or however, onto the computer, however they're expressing their knowledge. And then the last area is dyscalculia. I always think of it because of a calculator. It's a student's ability to do mathematical calculations and problem solve. And it can be one or the other, and often it is both. And if you want to learn more about either any of these areas, you can go to sldsupports.org, and we'll send out information and resources But we have lots of on-demand videos specifically on all three of these areas if you want to learn more about each one. So now that we've discussed the definition of SLD, let's look at the characteristics of students with specific learning disabilities. So the characteristics can be broken into three areas: cognitive, behavior, and social. So as I discuss these characteristics, think about your own child. Are these characteristics that you see? So the first area we're going to talk about are academic characteristics. And one thing that's really important to note, and I'm sure all of you know this, is that students with specific learning disabilities have intelligence that is average to above average. And that many students with specific learning disabilities have also been diagnosed with ADHD. So there's a very high comorbidity rate, which means co-occurring, or students may have an LD label as primary and ADHD as secondary, or it could be reversed. But a total of 17 studies examined ADHD and LD comorbidity, revealing that there was a mean comorbidity rate between at 45.1%. Another study found that rate to be between 30 and 60%. And it's really hard. Obviously, that's a very broad range, and it's hard to pinpoint that because ADHD falls under the category of other health impaired. So we talked at the beginning how there are 13 different categories as listed by IDEA, disability categories listed in IDEA. And ADHD is not its own category. It falls under OHI. So students under OHI could have lots of different labels. It could be ADHD, it could be a health condition, it could be diabetes. So it's hard to pinpoint that number exactly. But many of you are probably familiar with the signs of ADHD. With inattentiveness, students may have a short attention span or be easily distracted. They may make careless mistakes. They could appear forgetful, or they could lose things. They may have difficulty carrying out instruction, changing tasks, difficulty with organizing. And then the main signs of hyperactivity or impulsiveness could be unable to sit still, constantly fidgeting, being unable to concentrate on tasks, being unable to wait to take their turn, acting without thinking, interrupting conversations. So if you think back to all those areas that are impacted for students with specific learning disabilities, thinking, reading, writing, mathematical calculations, spelling, listening, and then if you add ADHD on top of that, whether it's inattentiveness or impulsivity, you can really see how students may struggle. Another area that students with specific learning disabilities have difficulty with is both short and long-term memory. So it's challenging for students to retain information. Students with specific learning disabilities may also have slower processing skills, which you may see this at home when you ask kids to complete a task. I always think about when my son would come home from school, I may say, okay, put your coat in the closet, hang your backpack up on the hook. When you go upstairs, grab the stuff on the stairs, and then bring me down your laundry before you start playing video games or whatever it is. And an hour later, I'm still downstairs waiting on the laundry, right? I'm sure all of you have been in a very similar situation. So if your student struggles and has slower processing skills, they may be thinking about, okay, putting my coat up, and they miss all those other things, or maybe they latch onto the very last thing and it's, okay, I'll bring the laundry down when I go upstairs. And then, of course, they go upstairs and they get distracted by other things. So the laundry doesn't get taken down. So thinking about that slower processing skills, and we're going to talk about ways that will support students who struggle with that. And then the next area for characteristics is behavior. And of course, this is the big one. Is behavior due to lack of academic knowledge, or is lack of academic knowledge caused by behavior? And of course, it's difficult to answer that question, and it's different for every single student. But what we do know is that we see frustration with academics, which can lead into other areas. This frustration could be manifested in multiple ways, including shutting down, acting out, forgetting materials, and you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes around the forgetting materials, task avoidance, stomach aches, just to name a few. So I always think about the forgetting materials, and this ages me a bit, but it's when kids still had textbooks that they brought home with them all the time. Only my son did not bring his textbook home because he did not want to do the work. It's a little more challenging now that most things are available online, but it may be, oh, I forgot my Chromebook at school, or oh, I forgot my charger and my Chromebook is dead. You may see behaviors as a result of feeling frustrated about academics or trying to avoid doing it. And then the last area that we're going to talk about is social characteristics. And I think we always think about academics, we think about kids with learning disabilities, and we may think about behavior, but we don't often think about the social characteristics. There was a 2007 study titled, "Why Are Students with Learning Disabilities Depressed?" And it found that failure in academic tasks may constitute a stress factor that can trigger a depression episode, particularly in students with specific learning disabilities. So we sometimes see children with disabilities struggling to make friends, which can cause loneliness. So we're always very quick to look at how to support them academically and what we can do, but we definitely don't want to forget that social piece. And we want to make sure we support students' academic needs, their behavior needs, and their social needs. And then the last thing I want to share in this section is I just want to look at continuum of services. If your student has had an IEP for a long time, you're probably very familiar with this, but if you're newer to your student having a learning disability, you may not be as aware. So really what this is, according to IDEA, students with specific learning disabilities must be placed in their least restrictive environment, or LRE, to the maximum extent appropriate, which all that means is that they must be educated in the general education setting as much as appropriate. So when you look at this kind of spectrum of services, if you look, the least restrictive placement would be general education and with supports. The next area could be in a resource room where the students have their tests read, or where they get intervention support in reading, writing, or math, perhaps in other areas. And then some students require more instructional placement, so they may be in a classroom with other students with specific learning disabilities or other areas of disability. And then it gets more restrictive from there. But the goal would be that students are able to stay in the general education placement with appropriate supports. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So now that we have a solid foundation on what learning disabilities are and the characteristics of students with specific learning disabilities, let's talk about school supports. So the first two sections really provided a picture of what children with specific learning disabilities look like. For this section, I'm going to discuss the accommodations and then practices that support students with specific learning disabilities. The good news is there are lots of things that you can easily incorporate into your daily routine, or that teachers can incorporate into their daily lessons that help students with specific learning disabilities. So again, the first thing we're going to talk about are accommodations. And I want to read the definition of accommodations first, again, just so we're all on the same page. So accommodations are adjustments made in how a student with a disability is taught or tested. Accommodations do not change what the student is taught or what he or she is expected to know. So when you're changing what is taught, that's more of a modification. We're talking about accommodations. So there are 5 different types or areas of accommodations. So there's presentation, response, timing, setting, and technology. And again, if your child has had an IEP for a while, you're going to be familiar with some of this stuff. If you're new to it, this is really important for you to know what accommodations are available so that you can support and advocate for your child. So the first area we're going to talk about are those presentation accommodations. The first one, provide audio, is the most commonly needed, requested, required accommodation for students with specific learning disabilities and dyslexia. And it allows text to speech and provides access for textbooks, novels, assignments, and tests. There are a lot of websites and apps available now that support text to speech, and Chromebooks and iPhones have a lot of accessibility features that allow for text to speech. And again, I'm going to age myself, but when we used to request books on tape, you know, we would have to wait for that giant tape recorder to arrive and cassette tapes or CDs to come so that students could listen to it. There are so many accessibility features on things that make this much easier than what it used to be. The next one is to reduce visual clutter. And when teachers are making assignments or you're helping your child create assignments or work on their assignments, you always want to think about how to try to keep the page as clutter-free as possible. It needs to be in a plain font, 12-point or larger. If you're making assignments for your student to practice on, you want to make sure there's enough space for students to write their answer or complete a problem. If you're helping them with their math, one thing that students with learning disabilities really struggle with is being able to line up those problems. So an easy way to help with that is to buy graph paper so that they put the numbers in each of those little boxes. That's one fairly simple way to support students. And again, just to think about reducing that visual clutter on pages. You want to make sure teachers are presenting instructions verbally, not just saying, here, read the directions on this assignment and complete it, right? We want to make sure teachers are breaking down those directions if needed, that they're reading them aloud, and they're checking for understanding before the students start, because we want to make sure they understand what the task is of the assignment, not to get stuck in that directions piece. And I talked about simplifying instructions along with that as well. So then the next area is allow for verbal responses. And again, this is so much easier because of technology. So one way this can be accomplished is by allowing for answers to be dictated to a scribe if you have someone who is available, or you can have them just record answers that teachers could then listen to later. You could assign the role, or a teacher could assign the role of a reporter to a student who has strong writing skills and allow the student with a specific learning disability to contribute verbally in a group. And of course, there is speech to text, which is a complete game changer for those students that have a learning disability in written expression or dysgraphia. Speech to text is an accommodation that can help them really show what they know in a way where their disability does not impact that. And I know for me personally, I would think based on the assignments that students turned in that they didn't understand what was going on, and then we'd just be talking about whatever the topic was, and I would go, oh, okay, he really does get it. He really does understand. So having the opportunity to allow for verbal responses will really allow students to show what they know. And then the next area is timing accommodations. And the first one is to allow frequent breaks. And honestly, when I was in the classroom, I didn't give enough weight to this, but it is so true. Students who complete assignments quickly get breaks during the day. They get an opportunity to relax and take a brain break. So if teachers give kids 20 minutes in class to complete an assignment, if a student gets done quickly, they will have 10 minutes to read or doodle or put their head down, or maybe if they're on a Chromebook, they can play an academic game or do something fun. But for students with specific learning disabilities, where it may take them longer to complete work, they work up to that 20 minutes, sometimes get done or not, and then they automatically move on to the next thing. So it's really important to bring that to the classroom teachers' minds, and for you when you're working for your children at home to think, okay, I have to be really intentional and give them that break in between what we're doing. Another area is extended time on tests and assignments. So extended time is great, particularly for students who have slower processing skills. They may need more time to complete their assignments, but I think what's even more beneficial and more, I don't want to say user-friendly, that's not exactly the best way to say it, but it makes more sense in a classroom setting, I think, is to reduce the assignment length. That is definitely an alternative to extended time. Extended time, if they always have extended time, then they're always going to be behind on what they're doing. But with reducing assignment length, if as a classroom teacher, I think, okay, this is going to take my students 15 minutes to complete, but it really takes kids with learning disabilities 30 minutes to complete, and then you times that by 7 classes per day, kids are going to have a lot of homework. Kids with learning disabilities are going to have a lot of homework, whereas their typical peers may not. So reducing that assignment length can just take some of that cognitive load off and allow them to focus on and do those assignments without it really taking a long time to get it done. And anybody who has sat with their child at the dinner table trying to help them with their homework assignments knows how frustrating it is for them, particularly if they know other kids don't have to take homework home the way that they do, or it doesn't take them as long to complete their assignments. So, of course, teachers want to make sure, and you want to make sure that teachers are still requiring that same level of difficulty in what they have to complete. But if they have to do 3 math problems in every area, well, they could do 2 problems instead of 3, and still teachers could still be able to determine if they understand the content. And then the last areas of accommodations are setting and technology. So preferred seating should be determined on an individual basis. So for example, not all kids with specific learning disabilities should be required to sit in the front of the room. A lot of my students with learning disabilities preferred to sit in the back corner, so everybody didn't notice if they raised their hand or needed help. I could just quietly be in the back of the room providing support. And then the next one is to eliminate distractions. So if you're at home working with kids and there's lots of stuff on the table or on their desk that they can fidget with or mess with, those are easy distractions. Or for teachers in a classroom to try to eliminate some of those distractions that are around. A lot of students with learning disabilities do better if their tests are administered in small groups. Again, particularly those kids who it takes a little bit longer, they may feel pressure to hurry through an assignment if other kids are getting done. So they may just stop working, or they may hurry through and make silly mistakes. And then the last 2 accommodations are those tech accommodations. Of course, most kids who have a learning disability in math, calculator is a common accommodation, or a multiplication chart. Just again, take some of that cognitive load off after they understand the concept. And then of course, lots of assistive technology, and that is definitely a presentation all of its own. And this list of accommodations is not all inclusive. This is just some of the more common ones that may impact or support most kids. So then this next area, they are high leverage practices. And I've done this presentation before for teachers in the past, and I was going to take all this out, but when I was looking at it, I thought about, you're working with your kids at home, so it's important that you understand those high leverage practices to help work with your students. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of areas, and I included kind of all of the information about high leverage practices in here. So if you want to go back and refer to it later, you can, but I'm just going to talk through a couple of them. So if you want to go ahead and skip through to the explicit instruction slide, and explicit instruction is it. So anytime you teach your child, or a teacher teaches a student with an IEP, really, a new skill, they should use explicit instruction. And it is just like it sounds. Explicitly teach the skills. So I have attended a lot of professional development, and the common theme through all of them is using explicit instruction to teach students skills, particularly new skills. So if you'll go to the gradual release of responsibility slide. So the biggest thing with explicit instruction, and there's lots of different areas, is focusing on that gradual release of responsibility. So as a classroom teacher or as a parent, when I'm teaching my child a new skill, I really want to look at these different areas. So I will do it and I will provide explicit instruction and I'll talk through what I'm doing. We'll do that together with guided practice, and you could work, with your child on something so you do it together, and then the child does it independently. So it's really that I do as the teacher or the parent, we do together, and then the student does that independently. And again, if you want more information on this, you can look up anything by Anita Archer. She is the queen of explicit instruction, and there's a ton of great videos where she really describes this. But the first thing I want to talk about, thinking about this gradual release of responsibility, is modeling. And that first thing is show and tell. So it's really important to give your children examples of products, or for classroom teachers to give students examples of the end product. So what does a really good essay look like? What does a really good project look like? And maybe you want to share both good examples and bad examples. And I always, when I think about this, I think about, when we teach our children to tie their shoes, you wouldn't just tell them how to do that. You would model what that looks like, and you would show them how to do it. And I think about it, when you first teach your child how to load the dishwasher, they're going to see a good example of what that looks like. Then you're going to do it together. And as you're doing it together, you're going to think aloud, or you want to think aloud and say why you're doing what you're doing. So, okay, I'm going to put the cups on the top row and I need to turn them upside down so they don't fill with water and they get clean. Okay, and the pots and the pans go on the bottom row, and this is how I'm going to do it so that I could get everything in. So you want to talk that out. Same thing with teachers when they're teaching a new skill. They should talk through that process out loud so kids in real time can see how the teacher or how you're problem solving and how you're critical thinking. So that is a really important, that modeling and show and telling piece is so important. And then the next area that you want to think about with explicit instruction is giving kids time to talk through what they're doing. So let them talk about it and verbally make sense of it. And then the other HLP that I want to talk about is feedback. And of course, you give your kids feedback all the time. But there are ways to do that that are most effective. So if you'll skip to the guidelines, for giving positive feedback slide. So these are just a couple of areas. You want to be really specific. It's great to say great job, but you want to give them specific feedback on what they're doing a good job on. You want to focus on effort and behavior, not always just results. So if they do a good job loading the dishwasher, but it's not perfect, focus on that effort and their behavior, and then helping them understand maybe what they need to do differently the next time. You want to encourage children so they develop that internal motivation of their own, which we know is challenging, particularly when we're talking about them doing chores at home. And that feedback needs to be immediate. So you don't want to reinforce or provide them positive feedback on something that they did 2 weeks ago. It will have less of an impact. So I just put a couple of examples on here. The first one is if your child takes out the trash, maybe say, nice work. I noticed how you tied the bag and put a new one into. Super thorough. And I know that, so like I could get them to take the trash out, but never to put a new bag in. So you want to positively reinforce that behavior you want to see. So you want to be really specific. And then the next example is, look at you folding everything so neatly. That shows a lot of care and effort. So as maybe they're doing laundry. And of course, this can apply to academics and lots of other things, but those are just a couple of examples that I thought of about really showing specific feedback on what you want your children to do. So I guess we probably should have put all the things. I'm guessing that lots of parents would have marked all the areas that students struggle with. So thinking about motivation, completing tasks, doing homework, focus, all of those areas are impacted by executive functioning. So that's the area I'm going to talk about next. And this is a huge area to talk about, and there are tons of supports with executive function. And if you have an opportunity to watch anything by Sarah Ward, I would encourage you to do so, or if you have an opportunity to go to one of her trainings, she's kind of the guru on executive function. But there's, depending on who you follow or what you read or what you study on executive function, there's a couple of different definitions. Well, there's lots of different definitions. So I just pulled out a couple of those definitions that I thought would mean the most to you guys as parents. Executive functioning is the ability to meet challenges and accomplish goals through the use of high leverage cognitive functions. Oh, and another way to look at it, the Iris Center is another great resource. Executive functioning is the mental processes that control and coordinate activities related to learning. So really, Mitch Weathers describes it as studentness, which really made sense to me when I read that. It's really all the things that students have to do to be successful. And I think a lot of people, when they think about executive function, they might only think about time management and organization, but we're going to talk about how there's lots of areas for executive function and lots of areas that kind of need to work for students to be successful students. And I kind of think about it in terms of a conductor. So I don't really have a musical background, but this analogy makes sense to me. So if you think about the role of a conductor, like their job is to make sure that everybody is on time, when to emphasize or de-emphasize certain sections or players, enabling all individuals that are playing to play well simultaneously, focusing on the full sound, being able to adjust as mistakes happen, and then refraining from wanting to stop and fix a mistake or tell a person they aren't doing well. So, and if you think about the brain, the executive functions that the brain has to focus on, it's really all of these things. It's none of timing, none of those things that a conductor does works independent of the others. So we're going to talk about a list of common descriptors for executive functions. And I know, again, this is a lot to talk about, so I just want to hit kind of all these areas pretty quickly. So planning and prioritizing, so making a plan and determining the steps, developing an organizational system, and I know that's one thing that my child in particular really struggled with. Metacognition, so thinking about thinking, how will they attempt to do something? Time management, which I think is a problem for all teenagers, maybe more so for kids with learning disabilities. Sustained attention, task initiation, or just the starting of a task. Emotional control, so the ability to identify their own emotions and being able to manage those, particularly when they're frustrated or upset. And then also goal-directed persistence. So creating a goal and working towards it. So that is a lot, particularly when you think about all those areas that are impacted by specific learning disabilities, thinking, reading, writing, spelling, doing mathematical calculations, and then all of these areas that a child has to be able to do kind of to be successful in school, in addition to having those academic skills. And one of the things that makes this even more challenging is there have been a lot of studies to show that students' executive functioning skills really don't reach maturity until they're 25 to 27 years old. Sometimes I think myself included, I'm still working on some of those executive function skills. And it's important to recognize that just like with teaching math skills and teaching reading skills, that you need to explicitly teach these skills to students or to your children. So you want to teach them planning and prioritizing, and you want to teach them how to develop an organizational system. So then looking at focusing specifically on academics, like when you think about those executive functioning skills, executive functioning can impact a student's study skill strategies and their academic success. It's required to complete large projects and research papers, needed to organize homework and supplies. So there's a ton of areas that are impacted by these executive function skills. And then finally, okay, now that you have this information, well, how can you help your child? There's several different areas listed here. So you can think about advocacy in terms of being a member of the PTA. You can request a parent-teacher conference, even outside of an IEP meeting, to talk about executive function skills and how teachers are going to work with your child to help develop those. And then in an IEP meeting, you could talk about how executive function skills are impacting your student's success. You can talk to the team about providing direct instruction on executive functioning outside of what you're doing as a parent. And then also thinking about accommodations and scaffolds that the school can provide to help them. So really looking at the academic supports. So then the last area that we're going to talk about is just a group of resources that you can use to provide support to your children. And all of these, oh, I'm sorry, this kind of went wackadoodle on here. All of these areas are linked so that you can directly access their resources. But a couple of really great ones, the International Dyslexia Association has a ton of resources. The Parents for Reading Justice, they have a great podcast and information. And then the Florida Center for Reading Research, they also have a lot of resources that are available to support students who have challenges with reading. And then the next slide just has the Specific Learning Disabilities Dyslexia Handbook. Most states have some version of a handbook. Ours was just updated and came out, and that we have a whole chapter dedicated to caregivers, which is why I specifically wanted to talk about this. So you can access this for free on the SLD supports.org website and really focus on that parent and caregivers section. And we also included some information on social emotional learning and the intersection between students who struggle with reading and writing. And then we have the dyslexia toolkit, which is a lot of resources. And then specific resources for writing. I've listed the Literacy Lifter, which is a free tool provided by the Iowa Center for Reading Research. Dysgraphia for Life has great information, and then Reading Rockets also, even though this is the writing tab and it says Reading Rockets, they have some great reading stuff. And then there's a lot of resources available for math. So there is the Mind website in particular has a ton of free supplemental core math instruction and early interventions. If anybody's read any research from Brian Ponce, this is his free website that parents can use. And again, these links are all clickable, so you can go back and access them. And then I just included some homework supports. So you can make visual schedules for your children, break tasks into smaller pieces, give kids choice first, then setting up routines so they know what those expectations are, and encourage self-advocacy. And then just general ideas for supporting your child: have open communication with their teachers, foster a growth mindset. So it's not necessarily getting an A on assignments, it's seeing growth, breaking tasks into manageable steps, advocate for appropriate accommodations, and then promote organizational skills. So the key takeaways from this really are thinking about what the definition is to learning disabilities, and how that can impact reading, writing, math, and all subject areas, how students with specific learning disabilities may exhibit or have slower processing skills, have frustration with academics, and maybe inconsistent performance because of those struggles. So you may see them do really well in one area and struggle in another. The accommodations that you can request that will help your child learn, executive function skills, which can impact students' ability to complete their homework, to organize, to have good time management, and then also to go back and look at that wide range of supports for parents.
Excellent. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, Dr. Truman. I really appreciate that. It's a lot of information. We got a few questions coming in, and I know we're short on time. Let's definitely try to get through as many of these questions as we can, and then just a couple of thoughts before we close out. I know you provided some key takeaways, but maybe before we wrap up too, just a couple of thoughts on things for parents to kind of think about as they go through. Let me just go through the questions really quickly. So a lot of therapists and educators talk about taking breaths. I know that for kids to calm down. I know that as a parent of a child with autism and you have a child with a disability, right? Sometimes it can be frustrating, right? And so what other than just sort of breathing techniques, do you have some other thoughts on how parents and teachers can help students to kind of calm down in those moments of frustration when things are not kind of going the right way?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things that teachers and parents could do. And I think one of the most important is helping students recognize when they're feeling frustrated. Sometimes kids escalate to the point where they have difficulty staying in the classroom, or we see really extreme behaviors. And if teachers could help kids recognize when they're starting to feel frustrated, maybe we could talk to them about those breathing techniques, or if they need to take a break and go to the water fountain and get a drink of water, or if they just need to stand up and maybe take a couple of laps in the back of the classroom. So I really think working with kids so they can understand their own feelings and recognize when they're feeling frustrated, that may help prevent more frustration and maybe more intensive behaviors.
Okay, great. Let's see here. So some people have asked some specific questions about testing and resources. Specifically, people are kind of wondering how you would get tested for something like dysgraphia or dyscalculia. I'm not even going to be able to pronounce that right. But yeah, but I think that's a couple of concerns from a couple of different parents as far as what's the best way to at least get tested. You're sort of naming specific locations, right? I mean, is there an approach or something that people should do to get that process started?
Right. So schools don't test specifically for dyslexia, dyscalculia, or dysgraphia. I guess it depends on where you live, but where we're at, they don't test specifically for those areas. It's just schools test for specific learning disabilities. So it would really be researching and trying to find outside evaluations that parents could rely on.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure I have time for you to provide a couple of final takeaways for parents. Certainly as a parent having gone through this, it can be challenging to know exactly how often you should be communicating with your child's school, with their teachers. Is there any kind of guideline that you typically work as an educator and as a parent that you think seems to work best? I mean, how aggressive or how assertive do you need to be as a parent, for your child in these kinds of situations?
That's a great question. And I think there are lots of variables depending on how your child is doing, but I think one of the most important things to do is to reach out at the beginning of every school year and introduce yourself, to open those lines of communication with the teacher and just let them know that, I'm here to help. And if you see that he or she is struggling, please reach out right away. Let's not wait until there's an issue, or if there are additional resources that we can help our child with at home, we would be more than happy to do so. So I think starting that conversation at the beginning of the school year is really important, and maybe every time grades come out, whether that's 6 weeks or 9 weeks, again, reaching out and just doing a check-in. If they're doing really well academically, maybe that's not as important to do, but if they're struggling, I think if you just being aware and making an effort to develop that positive relationship with your child's teachers is really important. And for me as a teacher, I always felt more comfortable going to those parents if we had those open lines of communication. I didn't want my first conversation with them be, oh, he's not doing well in school, or he got in trouble today. Really trying to start that off on a positive note.
Yeah, makes sense. So now before we close things out, I did want to ask you, and appreciate everybody who's put in questions. I did want to ask you, you provided a good list of takeaways, but what are some other things that parents should sort of think about as they go through this, they go through this process of trying to help their children perform better academically? Just a couple of thoughts and things maybe from your own personal experience, or things that you've seen as an educator that we should sort of take home.
Yeah, I would say the first thing is that your being here is a great step, because you're making sure you understand what your child's challenges are and making an effort to be able to learn everything that you can about them so that you can be a good advocate for your child. And, I've been in the position, and I've been frustrated, and I've been mad, and I've had the conversation with him where he said, well, it's all done. It's just not updated in Skyward or not updated in Canvas, right? We've all had those conversations with our kids, so it can be frustrating, but just know that you're absolutely doing the right thing by learning about learning disabilities and learning different ways that you can support your child. And I would just say use the resources that are available. There are a ton of great resources. I would check your state technical assistance projects, and I would also rely on some federal websites, like the Progress Center is really great. The IRIS Center has a ton of great resources. The Cedars Center has a lot of good resources as well. That's CEEDER Center. So I would rely on those resources and supports that are available.
Yeah, excellent. And like you said, take that first step, right? You're here tonight, which is a great first step. And you don't need to boil the ocean and do everything at once, right? Otherwise, you'll get frustrated and it'll be more difficult. Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. Dr. Rabatoma, thank you so much. Really appreciate you and appreciate all the work that you do and giving us your time tonight. On behalf of Huntington Learning Center and Dr. Toma, I want to say thank you to everybody. This concludes today's presentation. We are recording this event, so we are going to make this available on demand. So please stay tuned for that. We'll come out in a couple of days. If you've asked a question, we didn't get a chance to answer it, don't fret. We'll make sure that Dr. Toma gets a list of all the questions that got submitted. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or want to speak to anyone at Huntington, you can call us at 1-800-CAN-LEARN. You also can reach us through the website, which is huntingtonhelps.com. Under the resources section too, there's a great ADA, attention deficit disorder section with a lot of great content and other resources that are available for free. So I know we've given out a lot of resources tonight, but that's another avenue that you can pursue as well. So on behalf of Dr. Toma, Huntington Learning Center, Michael Hackworth saying thank you so much. Take care. We'll see you at the next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.